everybody. My name is Crystal Parteca, and I'm the project manager for the Northern Grapes project. Today's webinar is How Grape Ripening Follows Growing Degree Days and Managing Vineyards for High Quality by Luke Haggerty and John Toole. It's a couple of fairly different topics, but I think that it's some information that everybody's going to find really useful. Luke was recently hired as a viticulture extension specialist for the Lake Erie Regional Grape Program after completing his MS at the University of Minnesota, where his research involved tracking changes in fruit chemistry during grape berry ripening. John is a vineyard manager at the University of Minnesota Horticultural Research Center, and in that role has gained a lot of experience in managing cold hardy grapevines to produce top quality fruit. Remember that as a participant in tonight's webinar, we ask that you do not use your microphone if you have one. If you're having any technical difficulties or have questions, please type a note in the chat pod over on the right side of your screen. If you're having problems, I'll do what I can to help, and if you have questions, we'll address those during the break in between Luke and John's presentations, and again at the end of the webinar. So with that, Luke, I'm going to mute my microphone and let you get started with your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Kristlyn, and thank you all for attending tonight's webinar series. I know for a lot of folks it's probably tough to get out, and I know for me it's going to be a long ride home. It's a lot of blowing snow here right now, but yeah, tonight I'm going to talk about how grape ripening profiles follow growing degree days. And this is, I guess, a chapter or part of a section of my thesis where I looked at, you know, the overall soluble solids and TA and how they follow growing degree days through as they ripen or through berry development. But for this segment here, we're going to look at mostly just growing degree days and how they follow through the ripening process. So, you know, down here in the left-hand corner, we kind of see the berry development curve that we've kind of seen before, and you know, the xylem is kind of pumping in the acids in early on in berry development, and the phloem's kind of pumping at the same time, and then we hit the leg phase, and right before veraison, that's when the phloem really kicks in, and all the sugars and all the photosynthetic properties from these are really pushing the sugars into the grapes. And you know, this is really kind of where we wanted to focus on for the project. So we really wanted to capture pre-veraison. In some cases, it wasn't quite there because I kind of started on a specific date and then just harvested from there and went through and tried to capture everything. One of the parts I was trying to capture, trying to find or pinpoint, was where the phloem rests, right at the end here, and that's just kind of an important step in the berry development or toward the end of it, and that's just kind of when the berries shut down or the phloem no longer pumps sugars into the berry anymore. And if you look down over here, you can kind of see in the green thing here in the graphs, that's the berry weight, and you see it rises to a certain point and then starts to drop, and that's kind of where that phloem starts to, phloem rest happens, and then from here on out the berries kind of shriveling up a little more, and then due to dehydration we see an increase of sugar, and we kind of expect that. And then the red is how the acids kind of drop or degrade throughout the process of berry development. So growing degree days, just a quick background for you. The growing degree days, it's a measurement of heat accumulation. How much heat we accumulate in one day, and then we just keep adding that number throughout the season. So in grapes, it usually starts April 1st through October 31st, and that's how I tallied up growing degree days for my project. And growing degree days is it's the temperature, the max temperature of the day plus the min temperature of the day divided by 2, and then you subtract the base. For this presentation, I'm using degrees Celsius, so if things look a little low, it's probably because they're in degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit. If you want to get the numbers, you just multiply times 1.8 and to get degrees Fahrenheit. So, and what this does, it kind of, using growing degree days really helps get everything on the same page. We had, over the 3 years of my, I guess, collecting data and experiments, we had a very good, I guess, 3 years to do it. 2010, we had somewhat of an average year. 2011 was definitely a cool year, and then 2012 was a very, very warm growing season. in Minnesota. So on the left-hand side, we see, the acid degradation and then the soluble solids or sugar concentrations going up. And when we look at it with date, it's kind of relative. And when I first started my project, I was asking growers, when do you harvest? What's kind of your sign when it's time? And some people said, well, it's the week after Labor Day, and so they're kind of giving me dates or taste. And but with growing degree days, you can kind of match up years that have obviously are earlier or later, and not going by date. When we go by seed accumulation, and you can see that the data pairs up fairly nice, especially the soluble solids and the bricks. So a little bit of materials and methods for the project. I had kind of unique berry sampling. I didn't have that many vines to work with. I wanted to kind of keep it, centrally located, or I didn't want to have environmental effects into this scheme. But so in order to sample without kind of affecting how much sugars were going in was kind of a unique sampling berry where it kind of minimized the effects of sampling. So I just took one berry per cluster, and then from the different zones. Then those samples, there's 240 berry samples, and then they're broken into 4 replicates to kind of help out with some of the statistics, but not really important, I guess, for this talk. The growing degree days, there's really nice that we had a NOAA weather station about 3.2 miles from the growing site, so pretty close to what actually the heat accumulation was happening in the vineyard. And then I used ANOVA and LSD to kind of look at a lot of the data. The cultivars that were selected for cold hardy hybrids were Frontenac, Marcel Foch, Marquette, St. Croix, Frontenac Gris, La Crescent, St. Pepin, and also at the Horticulture Research Center in Chaska, Minnesota, we have Vitis vinifera vines growing there, and they're on a mini J system, so they can be buried. So there's a little bit of difference on how the training systems were. All of the cold hardy hybrids that were tested were on high wire or top wire cordon. And I tried starting my samples from mid-August and then all the way through October. For the growing degree days, the portion of my work, the objective was to basically make a profile of titratable acidity, soluble solid content, berry weight, pH, over the sampling days. Right before veraison and sample as late into the season as I can before they either froze or raisined up or got really nasty. So to collect as much information throughout the season and see how high the sugars can get and how low the acids can get. So that was kind of the idea, to see how far this profile will go. And then compare these profiles to growing degree days and see if we can use growing degree days, if growing degree days should be used as a predictor for grape maturity. And then it also kind of tells us, where, how many growing degree days do you need to, for berry development to ripen or to achieve the end. So here's my ANOVA finding. So there's a lot of asterisks and little NS, but basically, for this, there was some year effects, and we would expect that, growing degree days, we would have an effect throughout the season. But what we're really looking at is the year by growing degree day interaction. And if there is no year by growing degree day interaction, that means that they're pairing up nicely. So when we look at the soluble solid content or the bricks, that we see a lot of NS, and that's good, because then that means that using growing degree days and soluble solids or bricks is a good, we can track those if there's not a lot of other interactions or other things going on. For TA, there was a few grapes that it didn't seem to matter between years, but for the most part there was a significance between year and growing degree day with interaction with the TA, and then pH was not as good either. So I'm going to go through the results. I'm going to kind of go through them fairly quickly. There's just just to kind of give you a view of what we saw over the 3 years. The top graphs are the soluble solids content of bricks, the TA, the pH, and then the fresh berry weight down on the bottom. Going to mostly focus on the soluble solids and the TA as we go through these. As we can see, Marquette, the soluble solids really matched pretty tight. They were not significant, so basically on whatever growing degree day it was on a given year, I can tell you the approximate degrees Brix is going to be at. So that's kind of nice to know. So looking at going into next year, even looking at this last year, whatever growing degree days, you can say, well, we're at this many growing degree days. That puts us a few weeks out to harvesting. But we look at the TA, and we find a little more differences. St. Croix didn't seem to have that. La Crescent, again, the soluble solids match up real nice. But you look at the TA, and now we have this big difference. From 2012 to 2011, there's up to 4 grams per liter difference at a given growing degree day. So growing degree days was not that good of an indicator for TA when it comes to grapes like La Crescent or La Crescent itself, I guess. And we kind of see that the pH follows this linear slope here, and that's pretty common for all the grapes as we go through them. And the weights, depending on the grape, it's kind of all over the place. We didn't find much there to, I guess, weighing on. Here's in Frontenac here, definitely in the 2012 data that we had, the Brix were higher during the definitely the warmer part of the season, so that matched up nice. And then we can see how the acids really dropped on Frontenac, and it wasn't very well. They just did not seem to want to aggregate out of there, and that was kind of my other work I'll briefly talk about when these slides are done. St. Pepin and Frontenac Gris. Again, St. Pepin here, there's a big difference in the TA, and the sugars for both of these are very tight, and again, just kind of following with the other grapes. The 2 grapes that were not significant, meaning that there was an effect, were due to this one point here. And being that it happened at around 15 Brix and just under 20 Brix for Marshall Foch, they definitely leveled off later on. So if you were to throw that at a point, soluble solids would track for recently in Marshall Foch. So again, growing degree days paired well with soluble solids. For the other part of my thing was to really pinpoint this plateau point where the phloem arrests here, and then identifying that as peak maturity. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's when you should harvest a grape. Maybe there's a certain phenolic compound that happens before the phloem arrest, and that's when you want to harvest. That may be the time you want to harvest, and not at peak maturity. And maybe you want the acids to drop down as much as you can, and that would be past this point. But this was an important point that I really wanted to see if I could pinpoint in the cultivars as we go. I want to add one more thing. So I guess back in these graphs. So this data was taken from the Horticulture Research Center in Chaska, Minnesota, the University of Minnesota's research vineyards. And the findings I had here, so when I say it took 1,400 growing degree days to mature this cultivar, that's what it took for the grapes growing there. Other sites, if you're in the Finger Lakes or if you're in Iowa, they might not match up to the growing degree days here. It's a different growing season. The heat is really poured on in the summer, then really starts to slow down at the end of the season in Minnesota, and that's different how the growing season happens in other places. So, what's happening, in my slides here might be different than what you've seen in your vineyard, but the kind of take-home message is that you can use growing degree days to track your soluble solids. You just kind of need to do your sampling and see how that matches up with growing degree days in your area, and then kind of make your own, I guess, profile to see what you have. All right, so back to pinpointing the plateau. For this, I use the least significant difference. So basically, I just ran statistics to tell me when there was no longer change. So again, kind of working backwards statistics. I usually want to keep finding change. Well, I wanted to find, when there's no longer change, and I wanted to pinpoint that. So, and left-hand side here in Marquette, this first highlighted red area is at 1,439 growing degree days. There's no longer a change in titratable acidity. In 2011, that happened at 1,424 growing degrees Celsius. In 2012 was at 1,436 degrees. So by you know the more data points you collect, that kind of you're zooming in more on when this plateau point. So after this point, there is not going to be much of a change in the acid concentrations. So so now we have kind of the scheme of all of them. I wished if I just had the 2011 and 2010 data, they would be a lot closer. But like I said, the more data points you're going to get, kind of start to spread out more. The 2010 really, the really hot, really sunny year, I guess, really pushed. You can see in the soluble solids, really pushed that to the end. So you see that happen to a lot of different cultivars where in 2010 they just did not plateau off, or if they did, it was at the very end of our sampling. So they just kept going. They did not slow down at all. So just to go back to this slide real quick, we see that the 2012 was an extremely hot period, and just given depending on what date you're looking at. So if we go back to the grower who said, oh, I harvest on this date, if we looked at September 15th in 2011, there was 1,400 growing degree days. In 2012, there was 1,581 growing degree days. So just depending on year, 1 year difference, 2012 was 181 growing degree days, faster, I guess, or more accumulated than 2011. So it just kind of shows you the difference. So now so if you're trying to find the plateau, well, the sugars didn't exactly plateau when the TA did or when the weight did. And some cultivars they did, but you kind of see, some cultivars where they just, the acids slow down quicker or the sugars did. So depending on what cultivar you're looking at, there's definitely a difference in when that happened. Going back to the TA and why they're not really matching up real well, here's a slide from some of the acid concentration. So I use liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry to kind of quantify how much malic acid at each of these sampling days, how much tartaric acid at every sampling day, and other acids. But we look, tartaric and malic acid are the main two acids that you're going to find in the grape. And we look at tartaric acid here, and depending on the year, this is 2010 and 2011 data. We see that the cool 2011 data, there's just not as much tartaric acid in the grape, and it degraded at a faster rate than it did in 2010. So, and then I guess the highlighted red areas is what is the predominant acid. So Frontenac malic acid was the predominant acid. There's more malic than tartaric. Marshall Foch and Marquette, they were both tartaric acid, and some of the other vinifera. But that huge difference really threw off for most of the vinifera, where we see that in 2010, tartaric acid was the predominant acid, but in 2011, there was not much tartaric acid in there, so malic acid was the predominant acid in Merlot. So just that difference there really kind of threw the TA off, depending on the year, and that's why it wasn't an exact TA did not match up with the growing degree. And I think most of that happened pre-veraison, so that's when everything started, and there's definitely different concentrations in the grape at that time. So to kind of sum things up here real quick, again, the growing degree day paired very well with soluble soil concentrations for all cultivars except for Marshall Foch, and using to talk about them. Not so much for TA, but a few of the cultivars TA matched up. There wasn't a difference, but yeah, and I think that's about it for the growing degree days. The hybrid cultivars needed around 1,400 to 1,500 growing degree days Celsius to reach maturity. And now, like I said before, little disclaimer, that's what happened in Minnesota. But you're even different sites in Minnesota, this might change. If you're in Iowa, it might be different than New York or wherever you're at. The vinifera cultivars I looked at, they mature between 1450 and 1,500 growing degree days. So they were a little later than the hybrid cultivars. Like to quick thank, I guess, my my advisors, Jim Movie, Adrian Hedgerman, and then James Dean, who was on my committee. They helped me through this process, and it was a great experience. I want to thank all of my lab mates, and really want to thank John and Jenny who helped me. I had spent a summer in their back pocket at the research center before I started my program, and I really learned much of what I know about grapes there than in my project, but this is maybe a little bit of contribution back to us. So with that, I'd like to thank you and take whatever questions you have.
Well, so far nobody's typed any questions in.
Oh, that's too easy.
Yeah, I know. So it's not looking like anybody has any questions. If you think of some questions during John's presentation for Luke, you can go ahead and type them in, and I'll keep track of them, and then we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions for either John or Luke. So John, with that, let me get the presentation switched over. Oh, I gotta make myself a presenter, hang on. So I can switch presentations, and then John, I am gonna hand things over to you.
All right, I think you guys can all hear me pretty well, right?
Sounds fine for me.
Okay, good. So let's see if this is working. The scroll. Yep. Good. All right. Well, thank you, Chrislyn, for letting me do this, and thank you everybody for attending tonight's webinar. This is going to be pretty cool. I hope this first shot here gives everybody just a little bit of a warm feeling. Makes you remember how nice it can be in our climate during the summer. I know it's pretty cold out there now for a lot of us, but this is what we got to look forward to next year again. All right, so managing vineyards for high quality. It's no small subject really, and by no means are we going to be able to cover everything in this short talk here, but we'll try to do our best with a lot of different things and throw some ideas at you that you can think about and chew on. What I want to talk about is defining high quality fruit and how that relates maybe to end product use, so the different types of uses for different grapes. How that's going to affect the quality or what quality you want to achieve. We're going to talk a little bit about how to measure quality, I should say, and then factors that influence quality, nature versus our nurture, our vine care. We'll talk a little bit about some specific year-to-year differences, especially between 2012 and this year. Obviously, it was warmer last year than this year and earlier on, so there's some differences we'll talk about. And then what I want you to take away from this all is like just to gain some awareness of some vineyard practices that people do elsewhere, and what practices might suit your site specifically the best. So with that, we'll get started. So I guess I came up with a quick definition for defining high quality fruit. There's sort of two parts to it. What I think of as grapes that are high quality are those that are grown in a way that allows their berry compositions to reach their targeted flavors and aromas, plus meet certain chemistry standards suited to that fruit's intended end product use. So, of course, the chemistry that you want to achieve for wine is going to be different than for table grapes and different for juice. So these are the kind of things that we'll be looking at. As an example here to start out with, I want to talk about some table grapes, for example. Usually when places that are growing table grapes are specializing in it, they're generally growing the fruit in the shade a little bit, and the leaves are blocking quite a bit of that solar radiation, that sunlight. So places like California and such, they might be, with extreme solar radiation, that they might be burning their grapes if they're letting them expose too much. But this variety here, this is Centennial, which is being grown in Minnesota, just a couple of plants in our back vineyard. It does need winter protection. It's not a hardy vine, but just to show how that can do, we give that guy a little bit more exposure usually just to get the ripening done, and those clusters can reach maturity fairly nicely and produce some nice flavors, despite being sometimes a little bit longer seasoned grapes that the vinifera usually are. So the main point that I want to get through the whole talk is that sunlight is really the key ingredient when you're producing high-quality grapes. And there's varying amounts of sunlight that grapes need depending on the variety, but I think this is the biggest thing that is going to affect the quality of the grape, how much sun those grapes are actually receiving. So as you can see on this nice narrow vertical canopy here, when you got this dappled light effect where the fruit is partially exposed to the sun down there. I mean, the leaves are not fully stripped away, but the lateral shoots have been removed to an extent, and that's our main focus, is that fruit zone area. Anything that's growing up above that in this particular VSP kind of a canopy is just sort of let to do what it needs to do. So you can see the leaves get thicker up there and the lateral shoots are left alone. The same goes for a high cordon vine, which could be your regular bilateral cordon vines or your GDCs, any kind of vine that's grown on the high wire. I think you still want to try to maintain a nice narrow canopy, having those shoots cascading downward and staying in a relatively two-dimensional vertical plane still. It's going to be the best for your disease pressure control and also get that sunlight into those grapes as best as possible. So here's another shot of some high cordon vines. This would be Marquette in particular. One point I want to make too is, you know, the high cordon vines tend to be able to produce a little bit more, so it's not always that low yielding DSP type vines need to be done and are the only ones that are going to produce high quality. You can definitely achieve some nice quality in these other systems, that as long as you get that good fruit exposure to some extent. And what's going to determine you growing a vine, VSP or high cordon or GDC or any other system that's out there, is largely due to soil composition and water availability. So this is going to determine the vine's potential yield in the long run, which may take years to figure out, especially in a new viticultural area. The one thing to be careful about, though, is with crop load versus vine capacity. If you overload your vines beyond what that vine is capable of handling, you're going to have troubles with carbohydrates ripening not only the fruit, but also the shoots for the next season. So as you can see, these shoots here, they're suffering just a bit. They're not hardening off. The leaves have already fallen off. These grapes may be kind of ripe, but look at the wood. It's not ripe for next year. So you're kind of setting yourself back if you're overloading your fruit, your vines. I always think of measuring quality as there's a subjective aspect to it and an objective aspect. So the objective points being the measurement of Brix, TA, pH. Those are relatively easy to conduct. But the more subjective part of it is the aroma and the flavor and the intensity of these, and to some extent the phenolic ripeness. Color could be considered subjective in some way, I guess. So I know some of these things can be measured, but right now it's in a practical sense in the vineyard they're a little bit more subjective on what their quality means. So, and this whole business of finding what the ideal ripeness is, I mean, it's going to be different for a lot of different varieties, of course, but just as some kind of a ballpark range for some nice chemistry for winemaking, you would see probably those numbers that you see there for the Brix, the PA, and the pH. I mean, other aspects that you might be looking at are the seed color, skin, and pulp texture, how hard those berries are hanging on to their stems, that's the pedicel attachment, those kind of things. So, factors that influence the quality, and there's many, of course. The natural factors would be the genetics and your environmental factors that you see listed there. Sunlight and temperature being right up there, probably number 1 and 2. Rainfall is definitely going to impact as well. Soil and site humidity, disease pressure for sure influences quality, but it's the way the genetics and the environment interact together. It really creates this kind of nice quality if it's handled well. Other factors that influence on the nurturing side, that would be the way we lay out our vineyards and our trellis decisions, and then our practices, such as pruning. Pruning being probably number 1 influence to set the tone for the whole season, and then canopy management. Harvest date is another thing, and everybody's experience in growing is another important influencing factor. So here we have a fairly textbook example of DSP vine growing here. You can see it's kind of easy to, when your site allows for this, it's fairly easy to get the fruit in a narrow band and exposed to the sun the way you need to, especially when the pruning is done in such a way, as you see with the spurs spaced out like this. High cordon vines can sometimes be a little more tricky, but it's still doable. As you can see the progression here, if you're keeping your buds at about 4 to 6 buds per trellis foot, you should be able to get some nice exposure. And then the way the buds are pruned to, that maintains that fruit in a nice narrow zone. So any job that you might want to do later, such as leaf pulling or fruit thinning, it's all easily done in that nice narrow zone. And then the shoots cascade down nicely thereafter. And here's just a little bit more to illustrate how good sunlight exposure will help to ripen the fruit as well as the shoots. It's a very important point because we do need to think about next year. The sun-ripened shoots are very important for the winter hardiness, of course, as well as the bud fruitfulness for that shoot renewal zone. And here's a little cross-section of a bud. We do this work every spring where we collect vine canes and then we slice open the buds to see how they're surviving, and hopefully they're looking like this most times. But it's just to go to show that this kind of thing, the bud fruitfulness is actually initiated quite a long time ahead from before when it gets harvested. So I guess to put it in better terms, 18 months it might take to get those fruits from bud initiation to harvest. It might be a little bit long in some of our climates, our regions, but I think safely at least 15 to 16 months before harvest, those fruits are initiated. And here you can see an expanding shoot. So this particular shoot is bearing some fruit right now, of course, but inside the axils of those leaves, there's little buds that are, for next year, they're forming as well at this very moment too in this photo. So this would be maybe in late April or May. So of course harvest for this season would be a couple of months away, but the harvest for the next season is also a year and a couple of months away. So that puts you into that, 15, 16 months area. And year-to-year differences that we see, this is a very interesting aspect, and this is what this is probably what the nicest thing that Luke's research is showing is that the different set of climatic conditions that affect the growth and development cycle of every year can be somewhat tracked and watched, and this is related to the phenology of the vines. So, which is it's the study of the annual timing of these specific growth stages, and if you can carefully monitor these phenological points, especially with your degree growing day tracking, it's a useful tool for predicting which vineyard practice is appropriate and when. So here you see a list of a couple of the different events that we'll see in the vine, like bud swell, bud burst, bloom, aeration. These are all good things that if you can track these from year to year, it gives you a sense of when you should be, for example, spraying, or how far out you might be from harvest. Here's an example of 2012 versus 2013. This is a shot of Marquette, essentially the same vine here. I think the 2013 shot is just a little bit more advanced phenologically. You can see the shoots are just a little bit longer, but look at the difference in the dates there. May 3rd versus May 31st. That's quite impressive. But does that mean that the harvest is going to be 3 weeks later? Not necessarily. There's a lot of things that go on in between the season. You don't know how fast we're going to accumulate heat, for example, throughout that season. And plus, it really all depends on the intended wine style in the end of the day. So you can see in the bottom there for this Frontenac, I had picked this year on 2 different dates depending on what the winery had wanted. So just a quick note on buds in 2012 too. This is another thing that really made the fruit ripen up a little bit faster. We had some places 20% bud loss, and that happens from time to time, of course, in our region. So there are techniques to handle that, like double pruning could delay the bud break of the more basal buds, but I usually don't have enough time to go back and do the double pruning, so I'm pruning pretty hard and to my intended. And so usually I'm using like 2 to 3 bud spurs if it's VSP, and likewise 2 to 3 to 4 buds for high cordon vines. Oh, sorry there. Here's a nice little thing though. If you are, if you do run into problems where your cordon does give you a couple of missing nodes, you can sometimes regain or recoup with a little bit of what I like to term tandem pruning, and that's where I like to lay canes down with the cordon combination. This has to be managed pretty carefully because it can get messy quickly if you don't start lopping some stuff out in the next upcoming seasons. But as a quick fix, you can bump your yield up a little bit by doing this sort of practice and still maintain a nice balanced vine. So, a few more points that I want to talk about here on how to maintain high quality in a cooler, wetter season. These are some of the techniques that I like to use. Of course, you know, hopefully we don't have to use all of them in a lot because this is a lot of labor involved in doing all these things, but everybody has to do pruning, and hopefully you can find some balanced pruning. But the shoot thinning, shoot positioning, crop adjustment, leaf pulling, good spray program, 15 node shoots, and hang time, all of these, you'd like to have these in your toolbox anyway to bring out and use when necessary. So here's pruning. It's hard to forecast the season in February, but this really sets the stage for the rest of the season. So shoot thinning, though, early has its pros and cons because if you are going to be needing to do this, it goes fast when the shoots are shorter, but it may increase the vigor later. So this takes knowledge of your particular site and understanding how those vines are going to react if you are doing a little bit of shoot thinning to keep things open. And the shoot positioning is very important for VSP earlier in the season than if you were growing high cordon vines. Those vines you can wait a little bit longer for the shoot positioning by combing them down, but you definitely got to do it, get on it before the tendrils start hardening up. And just the point about VSP, you got to be on a little bit earlier in the season. So this is that bloom pretty much, and look how far those shoots are growing through the catch wires. Adjusting the crop is something that we can do with young vines especially. This is a good practice, I would say, to not overburden your vines because every vine has a limited capacity, and throughout its life, you know, its capacity changes. So in the early years, they're not able to produce or yield that much. It's really stressful for them. So you can see maybe there's about 2/3 of the fruit drop there on this 3-year-old vine. Leaf pulling around the fruit zone. This is something that you know, it's time consuming and laborious, but if you need to do a little bit of it, it is a good practice, especially for something like La Crescent. It really loves to get into the sun, I think. And notice here, this is sort of towards sunset, so the west side has got a little bit more leaves left on it than the east side. I like to get the east side a little bit more open, but I by no means want to remove every single leaf in that fruit zone either. It's a balance. So as I said, La Crescent really responds nicely to full sun. It can develop a nice muscat flavor if you get it in the sun that way. If you don't get it in the sun, though, it's those terpenes, those monoterpenes that are responsible for some of those nice flavors, they're suppressed because those clusters are in the shade, and it's really hard to get the flavors where you want them to be if there's too much shading going on. So, and that goes back to the pruning again. Overexposure, though, of anything, this is aligote here, it can be nasty. I mean, this is sun-scalded berries here from overexposure, and then we ended up with some 95-degree days in a row right afterwards. So this can lead to some bitter compounds that you don't want in your wine. The same thing for the anthocyanin development. This is Gewürztraminer. You can see how those browner berries, they're not bad tasting necessarily, but they're just not as good as you'd want them to be. I guess you're looking for that better pinkish purple color going on. So the balancing act is getting the right amount of sun on the clusters, and not too much, of course, but also having that canopy open enough so that the diseases don't take hold. You can see in this denser canopy of a high cordon vine here that black rot took hold pretty good inside there, so that fruit it's no longer usable, really. An important point, though, I always try to stress is that shoots should be 15 nodes long, which means 4 or 5 feet in length. This is a VSP vine, so the fruit is at the bottom there, and the shoots are growing upward. They've reached 15 plus nodes. That's good. Same goes for high cordon vines. You should be letting those shoots cascade down and achieving the same 15 nodes at least. We get into closer to harvest then, and the question of when to harvest. It's different for every variety, of course, and as Luke was showing, some of the tracking of that will show you how the numbers are stacking up as we get toward the harvest. You definitely want to be monitoring that along the way from right around veraison or so. I mean, maybe you can wait like a week or two after that, but somewhere in August you should definitely be starting to monitor your fruit on a weekly basis. So this particular shot of Marquette, this was picked in finally this year on September 29th. And whereas the last year we had picked Marquette on the second week of September, and our Frontenac was picked on September 29th. So we would have been done last year picking everything, whereas this year we started on that date. Hang time for the Frontenac family, they seem to hold up really well. So if you have an intended wine purpose, a different, maybe like a fortified wine or something like this, or even toward ice wine making, these guys really do hold up nicely. But the careful thing you have to do about it is not allow too many of those leaves and stems to get in there, because all that mog, as we call it, material other than grape, really can impart some nasty flavors and aromas into the whole batch. So here you can see these particular grapes were actually mechanically harvested after the frost dates here in Minnesota. So a lot of those leaves and stems and rachies and all that stuff got into the mash with everything else. So it wasn't very nice. And then La Crescent is another example. If you're trying to wait for that guy to ripen up and you got some green berries, you're going to notice a lot of other nice golden berries are shelling up. So you got to be careful about that. How long you can let that guy hang. So here's some Frontenac Gris from the 2012 year. That was already dimpling up on this dry sandy site on September 11th that year. So you know, if you're going for that kind of a style though, and you're willing to lose a little bit of weight in your fruit, and the winery is willing to pay you for that, that's not a bad thing. I mean, there's some cool flavors that can be produced in that. But it just goes to show that there's a lot of different avenues in achieving quality from these grapes. And I guess if you're going for quality and you want to learn more about quality, I think it's always good to travel different places. This is one place where I found how people are doing quality. This is my friend Uli in Germany. I worked for his father 10 years ago. He was a Winzer Meister, so I think if you do want to learn about quality, it's always good to go where the Meisters are, right? So it was a great time there, and this was us visiting them again in 2011 after being away from there for a while. We were exposing Riesling on the Mosel. Here's a guy in California. He was doing some fine pruning on his vines. It was interesting to see how hard he was pruning them down. He was leaving barely one bud per spur, which I thought was pretty surprising, but that's what he said he wanted to do for his quality. So, yeah, I guess a little bit of the literature that's out there. I mean, there's so much to read. These are just a few of the books that I've been kicking around for a while in the past couple of years, but the biology of the grapevine was a really good one for me to get going on and understand how the vine works. Grapes by Creasy and Creasy, that's out of New Zealand. The grapevine, from the science to the practice of growing vines for wine, that's been nice for me. The science of grapevines, the sunlight into wine pamphlet, that's definitely good. Viticulture Volume 2 practices. There's a lot of different stuff out there. So keep it, you know, in the wintertime, when you got a little downtime and it's cold like this, you might as well pull up a pull up a chair, maybe have a little fire going, and have a glass of wine and peruse some of these things if possible. And on some of the final notes here, I want to talk about your best practices for your site. Definitely, everybody's site is going to be an individual thing, so you should proceed cautiously until your experience is gained on that particular site, what practices you use. Because what I'm doing is not always going to necessarily translate well to what you're doing and vice versa. But you should develop a baseline with your vines. Takes a while for them to mature, which can be up to 7 to 10 years. Let your vines grow into their individual capacities according to the climate and the soil and your cultural practices. It also involves a lot of patience. And learn the nuances of each variety, I guess, that you're growing. And then also keep good records throughout the season would be one of the last points. We could keep on listing so many different points, but you kind of get the picture, I think. So with that, I want to acknowledge the team at the HRC. This is this season's crew of people that are working there. Jenny Toole, of course, the assistant vineyard manager on my right. Peter Hempstead, the grape breeder and scientist. Dr. Jim Luby, professor and director of fruit breeding. And Nick Smith, the winemaker and scientist. Katie Cook, the enologist and enology project leader. And then the crew, our summer interns, were Matt Erickson, David Wett, and Raina Akis. So it took 3 of them. A couple years ago when Luke was there, we only needed one good guy. So we've definitely we miss you, Luke. But this year we had 3 good people working with us too, and it was pretty fun. So with that, I do want to thank you, and I guess I'll invite some questions, not just for me, but also for Luke. So thank you.
Great. Luke, if you want to go ahead and get your microphone turned back on, we do have a question for you. It's from Diana, who asked, how did you manage the canopy before harvest?
So the canopy was, I guess, managed the same way as the research vineyard was out there, and how John, Jenny, and I guess, it was kind of minimal. It didn't go through some extensive, I guess, combing or anything like that. It was, we tried to get pretty representative for what we would know would be out there. So, but it was, the suckers were done. It was all high cordon. They probably got combed maybe once. Other than that, it was just, and I know John, he has these great pictures on his slideshow, and a lot of those grapes were, how many times are they sprayed down? Just 2 or 3 times, right?
Right. We're usually spraying minimally at the HRC to seed disease, so it's 3 to 4 times every season at the most. And likewise in my own vineyard, I usually get by with 3 sprays. Pretty lucky that way. I know some of you guys out that way are spraying a lot more, but yeah, it's what we're doing.
Yeah, that's how the canopy was managed. I mean, it wasn't out of control by any means, because nothing really is out of control besides the riparian in the research vineyards. But there was no special attention. I know I've had a lot of questions in the past about, did you try and see if there's an effect of full sunlight exposure, medium sunlight exposure, or no or little sunlight exposure. That really wasn't part of my experiment, even though I would like to kind of go that direction, but we just wanted the basis. So from my samples, it was a little bit of each of those things. I would say every one of the cultivars I looked at had, some of each, that when relating to sunshine in the sample set.
Okay, John, there's a question for you from Larry, who asked if there are any techniques developed to measure the amount of sunlight as growing degree days is used to measure temperature.
Oh, well, I'm sure there are, but I haven't really used anything like that. So do you guys have any input on that? I guess I just sort of eyeball it, if they're getting good sun, and I know there's things out there where you can do, like, you can poke a stick through the canopy or something.
Yeah, that's you can do those measurements. And why did the name just leave me? It was right on the tip of my tongue until you said poke a stick through the canopy, and now it left me. Oh wow, this is annoying.
I don't usually.
Point quadrat analysis.
Yeah, right.
You can do that, and there are computer programs that you can use. You take the measurements, and then it can generate that. And if anybody wants information about point quadrat analysis, I can send it to you. But it's generally more of something that you would use in a research setting. And then you can also use instrumentation to measure the amount of photosynthetically active radiation in your canopy. But again, that's some pretty expensive stuff, pretty expensive equipment to purchase. So I think probably for most vineyard owners, what you said, John, is, eyeballing the canopy and seeing if you think the grapes are getting enough light. So anyway, another question came in from Kent, who wants to know, what all do we want to track in our records for the vineyard? Rainfall, sprays, phenology, etc.
Ooh, well, there's a lot of things. I mean, it just depends on what you really have the time for, I guess. But yeah, definitely tracking the rainfall is good, and I think you really got to be in your vineyard as much as possible, viewing it and watching it and tending toward it to those vines. So it's like the old adage, the farmer's footsteps are the best fertilizer for whatever you're doing, in this case vines, growing vines. The more you are in there, I think that's about the best way of tracking things. You can jot a lot of things down, but you get a sense of it after you work in your vines for a few years on what needs to be done and when, right? So.
And just a caveat to that, John, like I was kind of mentioning, creating your own profile. So, collect as much data, especially when it comes to bricks and acid, and try to figure out, what are some of these climatic events, that was showing that the cooler year had an effect on tartaric acid, and you can kind of track that. And if you're having a cooler year, you can look back at your old data, and like this is a year a lot like 2010 or something like that, and then look at what happened the rest of that season, so you can kind of keep track of some of that stuff. But yeah, I'm a good proponent for promoter of taking as much data on anything you can write down.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay, we have a question from Eric, who asked, how many times throughout the season will you remove leaves from the fruiting zone?
Okay. Well, in my own vineyard, I guess I go through maybe, there's one good time where we try to get the leaves where they need to be. But, if I can go through and do another time, if we have the time or we have the labor available for it, I might do that. It's yearly dependent, I guess, on what things are doing, Some years, like this year, when it was cooler, we definitely wanted to get the fruit in the sun a little bit more to achieve the numbers that we were looking for and the flavors and the aromas. So we did go through a little bit more this year, maybe 2.5 times leaf pulling. But a year like 2012, when you can recognize that it's going to be warm early on, you may not have to do as much leaf pulling. So maybe a lighter time through just once is fine. And, if you have a really nice canopy, hopefully you don't have to do much at all. That's the best scenario, of course. But, of course, if you do want to get some of those fruits like La Crescent into the sun, you got to go through and do a little bit of work like that.
Okay. We had a question from Kent, who asked, how much sunlight exposure do we need for Vidal and Cab Franc?
Good question. You guys are more of the experts on that out there, huh? You grow a lot of Vidal and Cab Franc. We only have a few vines of both of those. Do you have any comments toward it?
I do not, because I am still relatively new to grapes as a whole,
yep.
And everything that I'm seeing is northern grapes, because that's what I'm working on. Tim, are you around? Can you comment on that if you're still signed in? He was on earlier, but it looks like he's gone.
Well,
so
I mean,
Luke, have you learned enough?
Well, I mean, I would just refer back to John with this stuff, and it's I would think it's trying to find the right combination of, you know, the timing of when and you know, if you're doing so much that you're getting sunburned, then well, that's, you know, I don't know if there's a really a correct answer. You know, everything's so vine and site dependent that you just kind of do a trial and error. And that's where, you know, here at the Lake Erie lab, you know, it's if you're trying something new, you know, do it on, you know, a row or two, and then try something different on another row, and then leave it on the row. So that's so you can kind of find out what the difference is versus going through and doing everything the same, and then, you know, trying to measure the results afterwards and have nothing to compare to. So that's probably not the answer that they're looking for, but that's, you know, that's one of the things that I'd say.
Okay, I just wanted to make a note because some people I notice are signing out. Before you leave, if you could click on the link there that I just posted in the chat pod to the post-webinar survey, I would appreciate it. And John, it looks like you started answering a question from Hunter, who asks, in your tandem pruning, why would you not replace the cordon?
Right, right. That was, especially when you have like older vines with a bigger cordon and you have some kind of trouble happening, you can notice that trouble. You know, the cordon isn't completely lost. It's just that it's declining. So in the meantime, I like to get something to replace in there over time, so it's not such a shock to the whole vine. It's not such a drastic lop off, and you're keeping the balance of the vine. That's the real key, is keeping that vine still balanced, keeping the right amount of buds for that whole vine. Because otherwise, if you get it out of balance, you're going to get shoots that are growing too quickly and too much, and it's going to create a little bit more shading in the whole system. All right.
Okay, and then Justin asks, when choosing a canopy, is the environment more important than the variety to the quality, or is it trial and error for each site variety combination?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty good trial and error really for each site and variety. It's hard to, it's one of the hardest things to choose, you know, up front. But I think if you have high organic matter in your soil and you get a lot of rainfall, you probably got to think about leaning toward the high cordon systems, or spreading out your VSP type of trellis in a longer cordon, spacing on your vines a little bit, because you got to have room for your buds. If the vine is going to grow and it wants to have 50 to 60 buds on it in the future when it's mature, then you got to have it growing on a certain trellis that allows for that. So,
yeah, I think that some of the work we're doing with the Northern Grapes project will help clue people into what type of training system is going to be most appropriate for their environment. Because, like, what works well in Iowa, where they have huge amounts of organic matter compared to what we have here in New York, is going to be pretty different. So,
right.
Yeah, so hopefully with the Northern Grapes project, we'll be able to answer some of these questions more thoroughly. And then one more came in from Diana, who asked, Luke, this would be for you. How do you determine the starting date for calculating growing degree days?
Well, there's different things out there. Normally it's from April 1st through October 31st. That's kind of what past literature has done. But there's also other work that starts January 1st. So, you know, but when I've kind of looked at both, you know, I've started my whole model on January 1st and April 1st, and most years I didn't have a whole lot of accumulation, and what I did, it didn't seem to affect the data too much at the end, but just to kind of keep steady with, you know, what's out there, and, you know, when other grape research starts their growing degree days is April 1st. So, you know, if it's for your own work or your own, you know, I guess creating your own profiles, you can kind of start it, you know, anytime. You know, in 2012 we had such an early start that, you know, there's quite a few growing degree days accumulated before that April 1st. So that was the only year where I actually had a little bit of a difference in some of this stuff. But I went from April 1st. That's kind of a long answer to that question, but.
All right. Well, I think that you guys have addressed all the questions. We got some really great questions there at the end, so thanks, everyone. It always makes it a lot more fun when we have good questions. So with that, I put the schedule for the remaining 4 webinars of this year up on the screen. I hope that those of you who are still around will find interest in some of those topics. I would also like to thank Luke and John very much for the webinars. You guys did an awesome job and presented a lot of really useful information, and I certainly learned a lot from both of you. So thanks for that. And thank you everybody for participating. It's, like I said, it's always great when we get good questions. It makes webinars a lot more fun. So also like to remind everyone to please take the post-webinar survey. The link to that is just a few lines up in a chat pod. So with that, thanks and good night, everybody.
See ya. Thank you.
Bye.